Welcome back to Untold Crime Legends, the channel where the stories history tried to bury are finally brought into the light. Tonight, we're taking you back to New York City in 1964, a city of bright lights, sharp suits, whispered deals, and invisible lines you never crossed if you wanted to keep breathing. This was a New York where power didn't always sit in office buildings or police stations. Sometimes, real power walked quietly through Harlem, wearing a calm face and carrying a reputation that could freeze a room without a single word spoken. In those streets, one name carried equal parts fear and respect, a name spoken softly even by men who claimed to be fearless. Name was Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson. He wasn't just another gangster chasing money or headlines. He was a symbol, a force to many in Harlem, a king who ruled by a strict personal code. And in 1964, one man would learn just how deadly that code could be when it came to Bumpy Johnson's family. Back then, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was its own world with its own rules. Everyone knew who controlled what, who to speak to, and who to avoid. Bumpy Johnson had earned his place over decades, surviving wars with rival gangs, uneasy alliances with the Italian Mafia, and constant pressure from law enforcement. Yet despite his criminal empire, there was something almost old-fashioned about the way Bumpy carried himself. He believed in order. He believed in respect. Most importantly, he believed that business and family were never to mix. You could argue with him over money, territory, or power, but there was one line no one dared to cross. His wife and his daughter were off limits, untouchable, protected not just by Bumpy himself, but by the unspoken agreement of the streets. Everyone understood this, from small, time hustlers to powerful figures downtown. Everyone, except one man. One evening in Manhattan, far from the familiar corners of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's wife and young daughter were out in an upscale area, surrounded by people who believed wealth and location made them untouchable. Restaurants were full, sidewalks busy, and the city moved at its usual confident pace. That's when a man, arrogant and careless, decided to open his mouth. Whether it was alcohol, ego, or ignorance that drove him, no one knows for sure. What is known is that he insulted them publicly. It wasn't just a rude comment, it was a humiliation, spoken loudly enough for others to hear. In that moment, the air changed. Conversation stopped. People looked away. Some recognized the women instantly. Others didn't, but they sensed danger. Because in New York, disrespect had consequences, and this felt like the kind that didn't end with apologies. Word travels fast in a city like New York, especially when it involves a name like Bumpy Johnson. Within hours, the story had moved from Manhattan tables to Harlem barbershops, from backroom card games to quiet phone calls made after midnight. People didn't exaggerate it. They didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough on its own. Someone had disrespected Bumpy Johnson's wife and daughter in public. No one laughed. No one questioned what would come next. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence, because everyone knew the rules had been broken in the worst possible way. This wasn't business. This wasn't rivalry. This was personal. And when something became personal to Bumpy Johnson, history had shown that the outcome was never loud at first, but always final. When the news finally reached Bumpy himself, Those close to him expected an explosion of rage. They expected shouting, broken furniture, maybe immediate orders barked into the night. But that's not what happened. Bumpy Johnson listened quietly, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. He asked a few questions, not to clarify the insult, but to understand exactly who the man was, where he worked, who he knew, what kind of life he lived. Then, after a long pause, Bumpy spoke just one sentence. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't emotional. It was cold, measured, and terrifying in its simplicity. He said, "Tell that man he just made the biggest mistake of his life in New York." Those words carried more weight than any scream ever could, because everyone in the room knew Bumpy didn't speak unless he meant every syllable. What happened next didn't involve sirens or police tape. There were no public arrests, no newspaper headlines screaming about a violent crime. Instead, something far more unsettling occurred. The man who had made the insult simply vanished from the city's social and professional radar. One day, he had a job, contacts, routines, and the confidence that came with thinking you were important. The next day, those things were gone. Phone calls weren't returned. Meetings were canceled. Doors that once opened easily were suddenly locked tight. People who once greeted him crossed the street to avoid eye contact. It was as if New York itself had decided he no longer existed. In a city built on connections, losing all of them at once was a kind of death. Behind the scenes, the message had been delivered clearly and efficiently. No violence was needed to make the point. Bumpy Johnson understood power better than most. He knew fear didn't always require blood. Sometimes erasing a man's identity, his livelihood, and his sense of belonging was far worse. The man was warned, quietly but firmly. Staying in New York was no longer an option. Whether he left voluntarily or was pushed out through pressure and threats remains unknown. What is known is that he was never seen in those circles again. Harlem understood. Manhattan understood. Even those who claimed to live above the influence of the streets understood. The rules still applied, no matter how expensive your shoes were or how fancy your address sounded. After that incident, the story spread like a warning passed from mouth to mouth. It became less about the insult and more about the lesson behind it. People didn't talk about what Bumpy Johnson did. They talked about what he didn't have to do. No gunshots. No public punishment. Just a reminder that some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. Business owners, socialites, and so-called powerful men took note. Harlem's code wasn't written down, but it was enforced with precision. Respect wasn't optional. Silence was safer than arrogance. And family, especially Bumpy Johnson's family, was sacred territory. In the years that followed, 1964 became a reference point in New York's underworld memory. Whenever someone acted too bold or spoke too freely, someone else would quietly mention what happened to the man who disrespected Bumpy Johnson's wife and daughter. The story didn't need details. The ending was enough. It reinforced the idea that true power didn't always need to announce itself. Bumpy's reputation grew not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a man of boundaries. He could negotiate with Mafia bosses, navigate political pressure, and still draw a clear, unbreakable line around his personal life. Balance made him both feared and admired in equal measure. For Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just enforcing his ego. Many saw his actions as protecting a broader sense of dignity. In a time when the community often felt disrespected by the outside world, Bumpy represented someone who demanded respect and made sure it was given. His response wasn't chaotic or reckless. It was controlled, intentional, and symbolic. It showed that power didn't mean cruelty for cruelty's sake. It meant consequences when necessary. Idea resonated deeply with those who lived under constant pressure and scrutiny. To them, Bumpy wasn't just a crime figure. He was a protector of certain unwritten values. Even law enforcement understood the implications. They couldn't prove or charge anything. There was nothing official to investigate. No victim came forward. No crime scene existed. Yet everyone knew what had happened. It was a reminder of how influence could operate in shadows, shaping outcomes without leaving fingerprints behind. For the police, it was frustrating. For the streets, it was confirmation. Bumpy Johnson's reach extended beyond Harlem, beyond race, beyond class. He was woven into the fabric of New York in a way few men ever were. And incidents like this only strengthened that reality. As time moved on and new names rose and fell, the lesson from 1964 remained unchanged. New York had many rules, but one stood taller than the rest. You could do business with dangerous men, argue with them, even compete against them. But you never involved their families. Rule existed long before Bumpy Johnson, but he enforced it in a way no one forgot. His calm response, his quiet message, and the sudden disappearance of one careless man became part of the city's collective memory. It was retold not to glorify violence, to warn against disrespect. Today, when people talk about Bumpy Johnson, they often focus on his criminal empire, his alliances, or his battles with law enforcement. But stories like this reveal something deeper. They show a man who understood loyalty, boundaries, and the power of restraint. In a world driven by chaos, Bumpy ruled through control. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His silence carried more weight than most men's anger. And that's why his name still echoes through history, not just as a gangster, as a legend shaped by fear, respect, and unbreakable rules. So when you hear the name Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, remember this story. Remember that in 1964, one careless insult changed a man's life forever without a single punch being thrown in public. Remember that New York learned, once again, that respect was not optional. And remember that some legends aren't built on what people see, but on what they never dare to do again. This is Untold Crime Legends, and this was the story that stunned New York.